we're going to have a panel on building a rejuvenation biotechnology industry, but I think after the last 3 days, we'll probably rename it Building a Rejuvenation Biotechnology Community. As I just said, Gene is with us in Stephen's absence. George Church is joining us at the beginning of the conference and the end. George, of course, from Harvard and the NIH Center for Excellence and all the other places that George has originated and created. We have Brock Reeve from the Harvard Stem Cell Institute that you've been introduced to quite well already. But I'd also like to introduce Dana Goldman. And Dana Goldman is the only person here who hasn't actually spent considerable time with you. So in case you do not know him previously, he's the Schaefer Chair of Health Policy at USC. And he's the director of their Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. He's got 150 articles and chapters, quite often featured in the press. He is the founding editor of the Forum for Health Economics and Policy, and he's on the editorial board of several other health research services and health policy journals. And he is the health policy advisor to the Congressional Budget Office, among others. So thank you for joining us, Dan.
My pleasure.
When I opened this up on the first morning, I said that the landscape of aging research was changing and that you all were the ones changing it, and we've spent 3 days talking about that. And I think it's clear that we do have a community increasingly connected by its investigation of underlying causes of aging. We have been calling it rejuvenation biotechnology. Aubrey will call it preventative geriatrics. Bernie Siegel might say restorative medicine. You could just say it's the subset of regenerative medicine versus aging. But in that case, please realize that our intent has been to look at stem cell and tissue engineering, the traditional definition of regenerative medicine, as well as the restoration of normal bodily function, its original definition that would include cellular and molecular repair. So what we'd like to talk today is about the community at this intersection of the gerontology/geriatric medicine space and regenerative medicine. Clinical challenges, funding challenges, cross-disciplinary modes of communication. When we launched this, we had some anticipation that we would demonstrate that this community was here at this crossroads. I think resoundingly that's come across. It's here, it has a unique view, it has unique needs, and the last 3 days have certainly demonstrated that. And if the landscape is changing and if the dialogue is changing, all 4 of the people here have been involved in that dialogue, and I suspect most often have been the instigators of it. So I thought maybe we would address 6 categories loosely. I've been frankly listing comments from speakers and questions from the audience for the last 3 days. And I thought maybe I could just choose one representative of a major area, and then we could talk about it. And this morning I narrowed that down to 12.5 pages.
Double space.
Well, there's spaces between the questions.
Oh, yeah.
But they do kick us out of here before 3:30, so please don't worry. But I thought maybe we'd talk about social and public perception, the basic research environment, translational work, touch on it very briefly, political public funding, private funding and private-public partnerships, and then for some people, elephant in the room, the regulatory environment. Rachel Dowdy of Baylor said, aging is a process that's undeniable, but it's also a social construction like sex and gender. When Neil Littman at CIRM followed up on that, he said part of the issue is we don't treat health. We treat only disease. But Bernie Siegel said, never fear. Regenerative medicine is a consumer environment, and it'll get driven naturally by the public. Aging is definitely a public health issue, ladies and gentlemen. No doubt it has been for a while. But if there is new change that ties age-related disease to aging itself, where do you think it's coming from? Technology advances, social perception, government intervention, disease groups? George?
All of the above.
All of the above.
I don't think my mic is on, but I mean, when on what used to be a rare occasion that technology would kick in, it could have a gigantic impact, and I think we all hope for that. Some of us vote with our feet. And of course, my shtick is that, so that's going to be my answer to your question. If you don't accept all of the above, it's technology, and in particular, gene therapies, which will impact the most severely ill first, but hopefully many of them will be developed with a dual use in mind, where we can impact health as well as disease.
Gene and Brock, do you think that the institutes and regenerative medicine centers are driven by the technologies, or are they the social drivers of change?
Oh, no, they're definitely driven by technology. I was just thinking about the social issues, though, and the fact that at least George and I don't know about the rest of you, but we're part of that big rabbit that's going through the snake, the baby boomers. And just having older people in the community, I think, makes a huge difference. And what I was thinking about was something Bernie said. He said he lives in an active adult community. And that apparently is defined as people over the age of 55 in some way. But it made him feel very uncomfortable, right, because he doesn't really know where he fits into all this. He doesn't really feel like he should be living there. But he's turning 65 this year, and so he's certainly eligible. And I feel sort of the same way. I don't know why I should be limited to a particular age group just because that's the age I happen to be. That's profound, huh?
With Gene, about the institutes are sort of driven by the technology, but we also need the outside-in pull. So, for example, one of the reasons that the institute at Harvard was formed was make sure we didn't just stop with the Science and Nature papers, but actually we're focused on trying to cure a disease, to have an impact. Even though you have to do a lot of basic biology to actually get there, to have that demand pull from the consumer, from the patient, is critical. And so, for example, for the last couple of years, we've had a session that we've run under the umbrella of the business school, actually, where we had represent from patient foundations, pharmaceutical companies, venture capitalists, and academics get together and say, how do our groups all intersect? And one of the drivers of this was actually a couple of women from the Multiple Myeloma Foundation who, like other foundations we've talked about, like cystic fibrosis, SMA, et cetera, have gotten involved in very early stage research because they've had to in order to help move the needle towards sort of curing their disease. So they get close to the academics, close to the technology, but they're also close to the technicians, they're close to the companies, they're close to the clinicians, and to the regulatory bodies. And so I think that patient pull is helping accelerate that whole process.
Okay, could I add one thing? There's no doubt there's a technological imperative, a scientific imperative that's driving a lot of the discussion. We see something that we can do to make people's lives better. But let me add some perspective, which is there's a 14-year difference in life expectancy between an African American who does not complete college and a male and a white male who completes college today. Suppose we develop a technology, and suppose, as a lot of people have hinted at in previous discussions, suppose it's preventive, and so it's not going to be covered by Medicare, let's say. So suppose it's only accessible to people who are affluent. Then you've taken that 14-year difference in life expectancy, and you're going to exacerbate it, and if the data, if the animal models are correct, you might exacerbate it by add 5 more years. The tension in the social fabric that arises when you have 20-year difference in life expectancies for men, for example, reaching the age of 50. I'm at the University of Southern California. If you look at Latinos who are not college educated, when they get to age 65, they report health status and health states that look like men 20 years older who've worked in jobs like I'm fortunate enough to work in. And so I think the problem, it's not a problem, but it's a challenge. And so the challenge, as you say, is to figure out how do we address these social issues. Now, I think, one of the issues that eventually we'll get to is whether technologies like these should be considered something that should be covered by insurance, because the whole point of insurance is to spread the costs so that we all get access to valuable treatment. And so, but I think we'll get to that later.
Can I ask something about this? I'm curious about how much of that you think might be ethnicity related and the effect of drugs on different ethnicities.
Actually, it turns out that about half of this is education and half of it is race, if you try to decompose it. And so there's a lot of work, in fact, our lab does a lot of it on the effect of education, and we know there are lots of mechanisms for why education has protective effects. The reasons for race are a little more complicated. They may involve stress. There's some very provocative research about early life and how it affects people throughout the life cycle. So the answer is we really don't know, but it tends not to be access to health care, surprisingly. So I think a lot of people will come in and say, hey, you know, if we had universal coverage, we'd solve the problem. Well, it turns out the health disparities that we see in the United Kingdom and elsewhere where they have national health insurance are very similar when you break them down by education, maybe not by race. The United States is unique in that.
And by
What I was trying to get
socioeconomics,
at,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
what I was trying to get at was pharmacogenomics. The fact that some drugs work differently in different groups, and they're not actually tested on the group that the minority groups, nor are they tested in women. And there have been lots of discoveries in which there have been very different effects, and toxicity in some cases, and lack of efficacy in others.
Yeah, so that's certainly playing a role. To the extent that it drives population health is not clear. I would say it's certainly true when you look at specific, so if you look at males with hypertension, for example, especially African American males, you'll see different effects, and there you would worry about that. When you look at population health, the reality is that a lot of it has been driven by things that are outside the healthcare system. You know, we've hit clean water, clean air, maybe antibiotics, and one of the most successful interventions we've ever had is to get people to quit smoking, for example. So, a lot of what's driving this are socioeconomic factors that are outside the scope of the system, and we're asking people like the people on the stage, as well as those of you in the audience, to find ways to solve, essentially, problems that are created by the fact that, we go around the corner and we eat too much. So
Yeah,
I'll put myself in that category.
So I was thinking about the kinds of things that I might be able to help with,
Yes.
and they tend to be in the pharmacogenomics areas instead of
Right.
the social issues.
So you say
Likewise, it's the other way.
you say access and social position are big factors, but not necessarily related to cost of technology, not necessarily related to cost of drug.
No, and in fact, one of the fears I have is there was a lot of discussion also about the regulatory environment and the FDA. So take the discussion about sarcopenia. Can we come up with a measure that would actually indicate future functional status and health that would be something that the FDA could use as essentially a biomarker to approve drugs in this area? The challenge actually is not at the FDA level anymore in some ways. I mean, the FDA has been pretty responsive about biomarkers. If you look at cancer, for example, we've got tumor size is sometimes used as a proxy when really the patient doesn't care about tumor size. The patient wants to know whether they're going to live or not, so it's overall survival.
Right.
But the FDA has been willing to do this. Where the problem arises actually are the insurers, I think. And this is where this issue of subpopulations becomes particularly important, because the insurers are saying, I'm not going to cover things if people are healthy. So right there, you've taken away all of preventive geriatrics. And then they say, I'm only going to provide access at low cost to the treatment that affects the average population. And if you ask, as you did, what about minority populations? And we assume there are heterogeneous responses to disease. My worry is that these subgroups are actually going to be more hurt by the movement towards things like comparative effectiveness and the other kind of policy reforms that we see on the horizon.
Now, Dana, your research work is at the intersection of the push of research development and on the other side, the reimbursement and the regulatory environment. But before we get too far into the regulatory environment, is it worth talking about the basic research environment? I mean, what Judy Campisi says very clearly, we are going to have a revolution in medicine and aging. And is it worth saying where exactly is that? George, when you opened the conference, you talked about gene sequencing advances and CRISPR and intrinsically inexpensive but very, very powerful, potentially therapeutic tools. Is garage biotech the big thing? One of the responses to your question about access and cost was Peter Diamandis talking about demonetization and then democratization this morning. And I think his aspect was looking at big data from genome to microbiome and that being the key. Evan Snyder suggested it's all in the biology, the limiting challenge in rejuvenation growth of the industry. Stephen Minger probably would say automation and the 24-hour monoclonal antibody. Is there a particular one? Is there a favorite?
Well, that list included some vague terms, but it was basically like mom and apple pie. You know, I think preventative and highly new categories that are highly specific and powerful and predictable would be great. And I think some of the gene therapies fall into that category. But it's so early, even though it's moving quickly, and clearly falls into Peter's exponential paradigm, it still will have to go through the same approval process. But we'll get early feedback in phase 1, 2, and 3.
I think one area that we didn't talk much about, but I think is important in the science and related to, Evan sort of alluded to it with his prediction comment, was the extent to which in vitro models of disease can help us understand a disease before it manifests itself clinically. So one of the problems now is, you know, someone shows up in the doctor's office with diabetes, they've already lost most of their beta cells. They show up with Parkinson's, they've already lost their dopaminergic neurons. And we don't know how these diseases develop because we can't watch them in the person. And so, you know, we've talked about in vitro models of disease for drug screening and that sort of stuff, but I think one of the real values, speaking of prevention ultimately, is can we have more powerful in vitro models to understand how a disease develops so that we can intervene earlier. So we're not catching it too late in the clinic, but we can because we know the course and we know what happens. And can we actually manage it in a very different way as a result?
So when Evan was talking, I think he was in the disease in the dish, you really have to have a genetic component.
Yeah.
So for example, for type 1 diabetes, there are some genetic components that you can measure, but you could probably find out a lot more of them if you actually were to study the effect of certain things on their insulin-producing cells in a culture
Or even
dish.
in type 1, why does the autoimmune, you know, why does immune attack happen? We don't know, right? Can you look at that in whether, you know, in a dish or in a mouse or something in a more interactive way to understand where the intervention and what the trigger point is?
No, absolutely, I agree. I agree. Now, some of those are probably accidental observations.
Yeah, totally.
So, Dana, if we add the models to my vague and apple pie list, Bernie Siegel said that one of the things that was stressful to him was that we have no national regenerative medicine strategy. I suppose this probably means we also have no national chronic disease strategy. Is there a strategy? Does it bubble up from below? Is there any strategy at all, or is it just self-forming? What's happening?
Well, I'm going to give a long-winded answer. I think you're going to see a pattern emerging in that, by the way. If you look at the way treatment developed historically, you know, diseases occurred early in life, lifespan was short, and so we went to a model where we addressed the disease, and the advantage was if you did something about someone's, say, hypertension early, they could lead a long and prosperous life. We've been so successful with our disease model now that we're talking about getting people older in the life cycle, and so the phenomenon of Alzheimer's in some ways is a success. It means we've extended life so long that we have to deal with dementia. And so the point is that historically, there was no need. We could get quite a bit of return on our investment by looking at each disease individually. Now we're dealing with, it's a rate limiting step. That is, we've been so successful with these individual diseases. Now we see people with multiple chronic conditions. You know, the average elderly Medicare beneficiary may have something like 10 doctors, okay? And so the question is, and you look at NIH as the perfect metaphor for this. I mean, NIH has divided everything up into all the different diseases. The problem is that that model doesn't work anymore. We did some work that demonstrated that if you could address, for instance, reduce the incidence of all these diseases simultaneously, and get some of the promise that we've seen, for example, in some of the animal models in biology, you could generate about $7 trillion in social value over the next 50 years, okay, which is a remarkable number. So let's say, I'm an economist, so let's say there's only a 1% chance that we're going to get there. That suggests 1% times 7 trillion, it's worth investing $70 billion in that activity. And if you look at how much we're investing in this, obviously it's you know, less than 1/10 of that. So I would say we're off by probably a magnitude, and 1%, I think the people here are probably more optimistic. I'd say we're probably, you know, we should be investing probably 250, 300 billion in this activity. It does raise issues, though, for the fact that we're going to get there by offering prizes. I mean, you know, no one's going to offer a $300 billion prize, so there's a role for government.
The whole thing is prize-based, though. I mean, an NIH grant is like a prize.
That's true.
So I think we're all sort of motivated.
Well,
right
actually, to be fair, actually, NIH is not the, you know, most of the research is privately funded by corporations. I mean, someone mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, it's $4 billion for each drug Novartis funds. And so that gets at this issue of whether, why don't we really need the private sector to engage in this. And to do that, we got to tilt the playing field, and I don't know if you want me to talk about that now.
Lily said it was 1.4 billion, and then Forbes said it's probably more like 4 and sometimes 11. But these are really, really big numbers we're talking about here. And when you say, you know, the NIH is prize-based, but we have a $700 billion investment problem. And Dana, you're saying looking at one answer at a time is not sufficient. But at the same time, Laura Asserman says, just I Spy in cancer, one form of cancer, was so hard that if I had known, I probably would have been too scared to do it. And that's not even phase 3. I don't know how complex phase 3 could possibly get. I couldn't imagine. What is the translational path here?
Go for it.
Maybe you should.
One comment on the sort of the national policy point that I think may start to go down the translational path is I'm not sure we need a national regenerative medicine strategy, but we do need at least sort of policy and coordination at the national level so that we don't run into issues like we did in the good old early days of human embryonic stem cell research, where different states had different policies. Because the government, in essence, abdicated. Yeah. And different governments around the world did different things, and different states around the country did different things. So, in fact, we had a project a few years ago where, you know, part of the experiment could be done in Boston and part had to be done in New York with a collaborator because of state rules. That makes no sense. Years ago, going to a conference where, because Michigan early on had banned any work in human embryonic stem, not only funding, you couldn't do it. There was a guy in Michigan who was talking about spending half the week in Michigan, half the week in Illinois so he could do his research. Again, that makes 0 sense from a national policy perspective and from the point of view of moving science forward. You know, and California, since we are in California, you know, to its credit, did CERM and all that good sort of thing. But on the other hand, you say from a national perspective, why should one state raise a bunch of money from its and spend all that money in that state, right? You want people in Stanford collaborating with people in Columbia or wherever. And so, you know, state boundaries shouldn't, and from that perspective, in the greater scheme of things, national boundaries, but, you know, let's keep at least at the national level, state boundaries shouldn't be driving, you know, how the work gets done, because that just ends up slowing it down. And I think, and at the translational level, you heard Stephen earlier give the example about, in that GE example, about being caught in that, you know, never-ending doom loop between China and the U.S. in terms of, you know, policy. So I think it catches us at all stages. And so I think I don't know that we need a scientific strategy but we do need sort of policy setting strategies so that those diseconomies get out of the way.
You know, let me just emphasize that I agree with that completely, and I actually think, you know, there's a reason why the big players aren't in this, and it has to do with the fact that I don't think it's the science, by the way. I think it has to do with the fact that there's no coverage, and if you want to cover a product like this, you're going to have to say so. An example here would be, you know, obesity is probably one of the biggest public health problems we face, and I think everyone knows why and has heard the statistics. But if you want to test an obesity drug or get it approved, you have to start with type 2 diabetes. Okay, so you've already segmented the market. Now, one advantage we have in the United States is that doctors can prescribe off-label. Okay, so if you have a drug that will actually do something about obesity, you might test it in patients with type 2 diabetes. If you could get it on the market, you may see it spilling over. On the other hand, insurers probably won't cover it for those patients. And so again, I think it's not the regulatory barrier. I know you want me to hold off on saying this. I think it's, you know, the ability to get reimbursed is what's limiting the entrance of the money that's needed to invest in this research. And that's why you see the public sector being asked to step in.
Yeah. So do you think if the reimbursement strategy were better or more intelligent, do you think that would trickle down to labs and research labs and somehow motivated all the way at the very beginning when we're inventing things that might become drugs?
Oh, for sure.
I don't see the immediate impact, but I can imagine. I'm trying to imagine
so
the
I
steps.
think, you know, here's the way I look at it. You understand, obviously, the science better than I do. But I know that there's Ebola virus in Africa that seems like I'm told by the WHO it's a global threat. I know malaria kills 500,000 people a year. And yet all these labs are doing research on obesity. Why are all these private labs? Why are they doing work on obesity? Because that's an American problem and Americans will pay for it. So do I think the money drives the science? The answer for sure is yes. We didn't have anyone doing work on orphan diseases in the private sector. And then we passed the Orphan Drug Act, and what it said is basically you get 5 years to sell your drug exclusively. So it gave a 5-year monopoly. And we saw an explosion in the amount of orphan diseases. That's how I got my start doing work on orphan drugs. And I was reviewing some of the applications, and I remember one of the applications was for left knee pain. So that's how they segment it. So there are games we obviously play when we define things as orphan drugs. But anyway, you get the point that there is a strong correlation. Now, the basic science has always been predominantly sponsored by public institutions, and they're driving it off science. But the stuff that's really expensive, the clinical translation, that really needs to be done here and is an important component.
Let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions about that. In reference to Mike West's comment about funding, that top on his list of desirable would be that the U.S. would just shell out $1 trillion to solve the aging problem. Also top of his list of unlikely. But first question is the perception of aging and funding in aging, is there impacts like the GSIG or other movements that are really impacting the funding debate at the congressional level right now, and what are they?
Yeah, so you mentioned that I advised the CBO. The budget, first of all, the political cycle is what, 2-4 years, so that's a problem right there. But the budget models that the Congressional Budget Office produces, which are Congress's official scoring projections, only go 10 years out. And so we've shown, for example, that the government could save about $1 trillion in Medicare if people just reached age 65 in as good a health as Western Europeans. So we don't need some miracle. If we could just get to age 65 looking like Western Europeans, it would save Medicare about $1 trillion. So there's no doubt that, but the problem is that's over a number of years, and that's not in a 10-year cycle. That's not going to get there. So our budget cycle is not developed enough in such a way that it allows us to make intelligent investment decisions. Now, you would argue that that's not the case in other countries, but they seem to have a short-sighted view as well for, I think politics is what's trumping the economics, so to speak.
So proper funding of aging will require a constitutional overhaul of the election process.
No, I don't think you need to get there, though. I think, I think education, and there are easy policy solutions to this. By the way, there's also, in Washington, there's kind of a fear of aging. So in Washington, you say, look at all these people over age 65, and they start wringing their hands. Well, I view that as a success. We've made people healthy. That's the goal of all our healthcare spending, is to get us to that point. So there's a disconnect between what we're spending the money on and the result, and so.
I'm always doing this. I'm sorry. You're next. And yet there is a National Institute of Aging at the NIH, which is one of the least funded of the institutes and has the worst grant success rate. Mm-hmm. And so do you think that politicians would point at that and say, we already did it?
No, in fact, and with this recent initiative with the brain and this effort to learn more about Alzheimer's, their budget has gone up quite a bit, although the money has been earmarked for Alzheimer's. So I think, the demographics are moving slowly, but they're obvious, as you said. We are becoming an aging society, and historically, we were making progress. That is, we were reducing disability among the elderly. But now, we're starting to see people enter, let's say, 65 and older, and they're less healthy. And so the trends have reversed, and that will require some solution, and we'll see something happen.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to a couple points that were sort of touched on in the last couple of comments, and that is, I think, and I don't know if that $1 trillion is the right number, plus or minus maybe. No, but in all seriousness, the role for government in funding early stage research, because, and back to your question about reimbursement and how does reimbursement sort of feed back into the system. And I think there's a certain part it does, like in the orphan drug part, but in certain cases it doesn't. And you need the government money to fund sort of open-ended, totally curiosity-driven science that can have, results that we don't know what those results are going to be. And that, that's not going to be affected by reimbursement. And now people can complain about NIH budget and do, academic centers get too hooked to NIH money and all that sort of stuff, right? And we know that it's tighter now than it used to be, and there are a bunch of diseconomies there. But that said, for example, anyone who showed a picture of cells in the last 2 days showed pictures of green cells, right? And some red and some yellow ones, but because of GFP, right? The guy who found GFP just said, I want to, why do jellyfish turn green, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what he wanted to know. And so you need that sort of open-ended science, curiosity-driven science to be able to be done in order then to have the tools and the rates, and then in order to do some of the work that we're talking about downstream. And so I want to make sure that, well, I don't know. I would advocate seriously for, the role of government is to do that because no other agency will do that. And that there are all sorts of downstream benefits that we all take advantage of as a result of that, many of which aren't predicted at the time because no matter, however exponential those curves are that Peter was showing earlier today, we can't, we don't know what's down the road, right? And we don't know all the uses those sorts of questions will be put to. But we want to be asking and answering those sort of questions.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's been suggested, I think it was Jim O'Neill, that on the executive side of things, that innovation is perceived to raise costs and thus can't be invested in. George, I know that that branch in OSTP reaches out to you very often for innovation advice. And for you and the panel, do you perceive that to be the case? Innovation is resisted because it's expensive. You need incremental treatments rather than...
It's not that expensive. To give a concrete example, the Human Genome Project didn't have innovation in its name, and it was neither innovative nor non-innovative. It was something between. It was a big project. It cost $3 billion over an 11-year period. Toward the end of that, they started a $1,000 genome project. Then instead of spending $300 million a year, was spending on the order of 17 or 18, and that's why the price came down from $3 billion to 1,000, is because of that littler, smaller project. So it's kind of like education. If you think education is expensive, try ignorance. You know? If you think technology is expensive, try just turning the crank.
Mm-hmm. So the reality is the innovation is the thing that's going to drive the cost.
It's cost effective. I mean, I think if we spent $3 billion on technology, we might end up getting some big bureaucratic organization that didn't produce technology. But the way it's currently practiced, it's a bargain.
So I'm reminded of the discussion between Aubrey and Neil Littman where they were talking about what kind of environment would allow long-term thinking. Is that at the NIH scale with a genome project and the next thing and the next thing, or is the answer calico and human longevity?
I'll just jump in for a second. You know, that we have some fairly innovative companies, especially the youngest of the companies. They get eaten by the big ones, but the big ones are increasingly finding it difficult to launch a research and development program internally. It's much easier to acquire. But even the most nimble of the young companies can't really, very rarely do they completely break the mold. That is an academic strength still, and very cost effective, since graduate students are not paid proper wage. They should be. They should be.
But as variations of that, you do see
the NIH won't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do see sort of companies and academics forming, you know, different types of organizations. So, you know, J&J has done these innovation centers. Pfizer did these centers for therapeutic innovation. Merck set up Caliber out here. There's sort of different forms of experimentation at that interface between academia and companies in order to help accelerate that sort of work. And there are different forms of it, but it's currently an experiment right now. We'll see how the experiments play out and which ones work the best or not.
I find that really interesting because my institute was funded by pharmaceutical companies to the tune of $20 million a year for the last 25 years. And a year ago, that money dried up. And the impact on us has been tremendous. But what it taught us, I think, was the fact that economics drives the drug companies. And so if you're getting funding from a drug company, you have to produce something they want. The funding is, I mean, they could change their entire business plan like next week and you will be left out of it. That's the fear I have of getting too involved with and dependent on company money.
Right. No,
Whereas NIH is unlikely to do
right.
that, but you know, they are in fact doing it. It's just a lot slower.
Right.
Yeah, I think, I'm not here, my work has shown that we grossly underinvest both privately and publicly in this area. All I'll say is that what patients want is a pill they can take. They don't want to see the jellyfish light up. And so the private sector, by putting the prize on, understanding the jellyfish.
Come on.
Yeah, you actually do.
Actually, that's true.
The jellyfish could bring in donations.
I was at the New England Aquarium and they had jellyfish.
Yeah, it's a circle.
They don't want to see the jellyfish taken apart into clear liquids.
No, that's true. They don't want them.
And studied forever as little identical tubes.
Yeah.
But lighting up, that's good.
But
don't
I
want
think
to see them in
George
the
said
blender.
something that's worth emphasizing, and one of the problems here, and where companies fall flat, I think, is he said it's enormously cost effective, and he's right about that. The technological improvements that we've seen in healthcare have been very cost effective. The way to see this is if I said to you, would you rather have today's healthcare at today's prices or 1960 at 1960 prices, most people would prefer the former. The problem is that people are now, when people make promises like this technology will lower costs, that's a much harder thing to do. There are very few things that actually save money. What they do is they improve health and they cost money, and the question is, do they improve health enough to be worth it? And I think, you know, when we start making promises that if we do X, we're going to save money, you know, I mean, the classic example of this, by the way, is actually, there are two examples in the antiviral case. Look at hepatitis C right now, and some of you may have heard about Sovaldi, which is being investigated as the $1,000 pill. Treatment costs $100,000. Well, it's a treatment for hep C and it cures the disease. Okay, so we have the possibility now of completely eradicating hepatitis C, which affects, by the way, probably 1.5 million baby boomers. And if I said to you, how much would you pay to eradicate hepatitis C? That number is very different than how much should we be paying per pill. And we have to start thinking about it in terms of the value of the health improvement.
So if you think about that on a 50-year time scale, if you eradicate the disease in the first 10 years, then you never have to buy that pill again.
That's right. No, and
so it's actually very cheap on the,
you know, a liver
level.
transplant costs $600,000. Would I rather pay $100,000 for a pill or wait till I get sick and pay $600,000 for a liver transplant? I think the answer is obvious.
I will save some time for questions at the end, but you have been waiting very patiently. I suspect you have something relevant on that topic.
I guess it was starting to be addressed toward the end there, just you know, discussing all these changes around the government regulatory system, the FDA needing to change and all that kind of stuff. It seems like, you know, with the gridlock kind of thing that we have in the U.S. government and the difficulty that it took to implement Obamacare and that kind of stuff, that trying to pursue that path seems like something that would take way longer than I'm kind of hoping that this could actually develop, you know, like in 10 years. I'm not saying you don't pursue that, but just it seems that the focus should be more about how do we end run the blockade as opposed to how do we tear down the Maginot Line.
So I'd like to address that. So I think one thing we can do that's very concrete and that's being done at this conference today is figuring out what are some biomarkers that'll get us to the point where we have the finish line in the regulatory process. Then we got to figure out what are the strategies that are going to get these things reimbursed so that people can actually get access to them. Again, you know, if Calico develops something fantastic and it's $100,000, that's fine if insurance covers it. But if insurance doesn't cover it, you know, that gets back to my argument about what it does to the social fabric. So I think it's very clear what needs to be done. I think it's hard on the biomarker side and making the progress to get regulatory approval. But how we get this reimbursed, and then the broader question, how do we get social acceptance that we're taking something like this? Those are broader challenges.
Can I ask a disruptive question, which is, why do we have to be reimbursed for everything? Why don't you reimburse me when I buy a car or a house or something like that?
No, that's right.
If everybody is paying $100,000, it's not really insurance anymore.
No, that's right.
It's a payment.
No, that's right.
And I'm ready to pay it without paying my insurer and then having my insurer pay me back.
No, that's right. And so, you know, that's a very fair question. You know, I mean, I could ask, for example, why does Medicare cover erectile dysfunction drugs? You know, that would seem like a lifestyle drug, for example. Is that really a disease? So we've made it a disease. That was a good strategy, and it built a large pharmaceutical giant. And, you know, along the way, some people got happy. By the way, when WellPoint was thinking about how much to cover, how much Viagra should be on their formulary, they did a survey of the men, and they all said, well, let's see, 30 days, 4 weeks, 4 Saturdays, 10 pills. When they did a survey of women, they said 2 Saturdays a month. So just so you know, the value of drugs like that to men and women diverge. But you raise a good point. So think about cars. We insure accidents. We don't insure oil changes. okay? And so is
And
preventive...
they don't require reimbursement to purchase the
Right.
car
The
in the
answer
first
to your
place.
question, the answer to your question is because we have a huge social reason to do it, which is it can save money down the line. So if we can, so why do we cover drugs? Generic drugs are free. By that argument, you know, everyone's taking them. They're not that expensive. They shouldn't be insured at all, just like oil changes. They're insured because they save money down the road. So if we can find a way, here the cost-saving argument does play in, but if you can find ways, as I said, to get people to age 65 or maybe even 70 in good health, you know, it'll save money, especially you look at what's going on with Medicaid and nursing home care and things like that. So the reason we do it is to save some money for the government.
Can I just pop in one more time? Something that George was talking about, there is the anti-wrinkle cream stuff that seems to work, and people pay straight for that without any reimbursement. And they'll pay, you know, like $700 a month for it, and also the, you know, there's other
Stem cell therapies.
Yeah, stem cell therapy, or just the appearance thing,
work?
the Botox, that kind of stuff, that people just pay out of their own pocket for it.
The ones
And if you
that
had
don't.
an actual, real anti-aging process that was, and it's better than your wrinkle cream because they're actually going to treat the underlying thing, people would, I think, line up for it. And, you know, I would allocate $5,000, $10,000 per year for it, you know, so.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, SENS Research Foundation loves that car repair analogy, of course. But, you know, we also insure against dented fenders right now, but not against oil changes, usually not against engine repair. Are we moving into a medical system where the attention is going to be now on engine repair before you have engine failure? And if so, what's the reimbursement strategy for that? Or is it, again, just direct payment?
Well, I think, I guess as the health policy guy, I'll go first. You know, we are going to move towards a model where we pay for outcomes, not inputs. Right now, it's traditionally been fee-for-service. You go to the, you know, there's a discussion, we're a consumer society, this or that. When I buy an iPad, if it doesn't work, I go back and I get my money back. But if I go to the hospital and they mess up, I don't get my money back, you know.
Unless you sue them.
Yeah, and that process doesn't work so well. But, you know, I mean, we're starting to see that actually they've changed that. So now Medicare is not paying for readmissions. And lo and behold, what are the hospitals doing? They're actually paying attention to make sure you take your drugs when you leave the hospital. So the earlier panel talked about adherence. Again, what we did is we said, hey, hospitals, you're on the hook to make sure the person doesn't come back. And they started taking an interest in preventing readmission. So think of that on a larger scale. When we start saying, orienting our health system towards saying, and there was another, you know, the greatest anti-aging intervention we have right now is exercise, right? Exercise prevents a lot of diseases, you know, and, you know, yet I had one doctor say to me, the best thing I could do for this guy is to take him for a walk, but I don't get paid to do that. Well, the answer is we should be paying for that. You know, we should be paying for the health outcomes and then let the providers decide how to do it. And once we do that, it's going to help pay for value. And so if this preventive geriatric paradigm, which I like a lot, that becomes enormously, I'll say, valuable to society in that new model.
And there are some people actually experimenting with writing prescriptions for exercise, and find that and finding actually better adherence. So okay, you know, here your prescription is to go for your 20-minute walk every day. But I think one of the interesting things that'll come up with some of the technologies we've been talking about is the fact that in some cases we actually have the first potential, maybe not curative, but therapies that can lead that, right? Because other than sort of clinical interventions, a lot of the drugs today are dealing with symptomatic issues, right? And as we look at some of these therapies we've been discussing, one of the questions that we've sort of talked about, and I don't think anyone really has an answer yet, is if we really are avoiding a whole bunch of downstream costs with some sort of curative therapy, is how do we capture, you know, that value, and how does that value get distributed through the system? And at what point do we know that, and to what extent are we really changing the healthcare economics, or are we pushing costs out, or are we actually raising overall costs?
Well, one way would be to monitor retirement age,
Yeah.
because that's a huge cost to society. If we could push that out 2 years
Yeah.
with anti-aging drugs and monitor that, that would be a big.
But then you have to reinforce it with the other social
you
mechanisms.
would, yes, you would.
You know, I'll just add to that William Hazeltine wrote, I think, on Singapore's emerging medical system just last year, didn't he? That these medical systems that are growing out of whole cloth in the developing world and in countries that haven't previously had robust or sophisticated health systems are starting with the basis of the outcomes model
Yep.
rather than the services model. So it's much easier for them to perhaps extend into that chronic disease system as well.
That's right. Someone has to, the only thing I'll say is someone has to take responsibility in that system for someone's health. And if you talk to the doctor, they'll say, I told the person to take the drug. They didn't take the drug. It's not my fault. It's not my problem. So, you know, ironically, so you look at a system like Kaiser, they have responsibility. And Kaiser will follow up
Right.
and make sure something's going on. So, you know, we can design a system here, perhaps based on a managed care type model that would do that.
So Kaiser says thrive. And usually what you see in the commercials is preventative in terms of don't drink, don't smoke, lead a healthy lifestyle.
That helps.
You think that'll extend into, we'll do preventative maintenance on you generally before you're sick?
Well, I think it would be interesting for a company that has developed, you know, a rejuvenation technology, for lack of a better term, to go to Kaiser and say, okay, let's agree, let's do an experiment, let's do a value-based. So let me give Hep C as an example. We know if we treat Hep C, we're going to avoid a bunch of liver transplants. You could have a deal where you go to a Kaiser and say, look, we want to track what spending is like for these groups over time. And if there's savings relative to what we thought they would be, you give us some money downstream. That's called value-based contracting, and it makes a lot of sense in the context of these technologies, if people are willing to do that. Now, the problem is going to be what George said, which is sometimes it just costs money and it makes people feel a lot better. And who's going to pay for it? And you guys don't want it to be covered by insurance, so, you know, I guess only, you know, but eventually it'll trickle down, you know, generic, it'll get generic or something.
Perhaps we could talk about the regulatory environment just a bit then. Julie Alexson said, the big challenge to progress. Evan Snyder said, nah, the whipping boy. Laura, as we noted, said I Spy was more work than she could have guessed, but the current path is unsustainable, like a rock and hard place. Jim O'Neill said of Health and Human Services, FDA wants to approve products, and they're good at it, and they're dedicated scientists. Companies want them approved. The patients really, really desperately want them. So what's up with that?
It's an open-ended question.
That's a big question.
Well, let me make it a little more specific then. Eric Siemers and Lilly was talking about how their drug, that entire community through ACTAD and other groups had seized on the I Spy idea, and we're trying to adapt a derivative of that for their environment. But he also, with his company, faces now a clinical profile as they begin to move earlier and earlier in the causative chain. He faces a clinical profile now that is probably, from the FDA's perspective, pre-disease.
Right.
So I don't know what the paradigm for that is at that point. Is that vaccination that you're trying to approve with the FDA? And what kinds of changes in perception need to happen there? And are any of them happening?
So the big change in perception has to be our willingness to take on risk. Now, most of the world practices something called risk management. They balance the benefits against the costs. They do the calculation, they go forward. The FDA sometimes does something called risk minimization. So an example of risk minimization is, oh, Vioxx has problems for some people, let's take it off the market. Well, it turns out Vioxx was a valuable product for people who had gastrointestinal problems, and it could help them ease their pain. But it's safe, given the furor, to take it off the market. Now, the FDA, I think part of the reason for the dichotomy in responses is that, you know, in places like cancer, they've figured out what the biomarkers are and they're moving forward. When it comes to preventive services, they practice risk minimization. So if they want a preventive rejuvenation technology to be as safe as a vaccine, well, that means you're going to have to test it on, you know, something like 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people, you know. So what we really need is the solution here is post-market surveillance. It's big data. It's being able to monitor people afterwards and saying we're going to take some risks, even in the preventive space, like we did in places like HIV. And oh, by the way, Ebola. They got that. You saw that they got that vaccine. Those 2 patients in Atlanta got the vaccine. The FDA said, okay. Why did they say okay? It hadn't been tested in 100,000 people. Well, they said okay because there was a furor and people wanted it. So we need to come up with a different paradigm, and the solution may be something that involves post-market surveillance or expanded clinical trials with data collection. So if you want to get this drug, you agree to participate in a data collection activity, and it gets reported in a timely manner.
And that's where I also think a lot of the genetics information and in vitro disease models will help us do a staged market entry, so that you enter with a small populations, whether based on genetics or whatever background, right? Or women, for example, who are understudied and undertested to date. And stage your entry and take on risk, or manage the risk on a going forward basis, as opposed to going from no, it's bad, yes, it's good for everybody, right? Because we're sort of in this black and white world today, and in fact we're trying to enter a world of gray, and how do we manage that process, I think is going to be different. So we have to manage it totally different, and have the risk management tools, as you point out, to do that.
How does the panel feel about the progressive approval or adoptive licensing strategies that have been talked about? That seems to be quite derivative of what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a good idea. It's a good idea.
All good.
We're there.
Yeah.
I'm cognizant of the fact that we may have a 4:30 very hard stop, so I want to make sure we have a chance to get to questions. So can't quite see you, but...
Okay. Well, maybe you can hear me.
Yes.
It's a little bit of follow-up on the idea of reimbursement versus non-reimbursement. So obviously you can discuss that quite a lot, and there's no question it has an influence. But people do pay to exercise. It's called yoga. We have it here in California. People pay for iPhones, and people pay for a lot of stuff, not just fixing their car, but they pay for things. And why? A million reasons. But maybe just one reason, because it's something that you do and it's cool. 2 sides of the same thing. So maybe how do we turn being physiologically young and healthy into something that you do that is cool, right? So if it was perceived such, then presumably people would pay for it. George's ahead of the curve. He's already willing to pay for that, and probably many of us are. But can you just do that somehow, and then people are going to start paying for it? And you could say, okay, those are cheap things, so you can't pay for Medicare. Well, people also pay for college. It's pretty expensive, but it's worth it, so we pay for it.
The problem is that, so Los Angeles is a useful microcosm. I live in Santa Monica. The obesity rate of children in Santa Monica is about 6 or 7%. In LA County and Bell Gardens, same county, it's 35%. If you come to East LA, there was a smartphone technology for diabetes that we wanted to test. Well, it turns out everyone still has flip phones. They don't have smartphones. And we tried to give them, we went to one doctor's office and we wanted to see how people use technology. So we were going to give out blood glucose monitors, and they said, don't bother, it's not going to work. And we said, why? They said, they're just going to bring it back home to Mexico and give it to their family who need it. So I agree with you completely and there was a theme of this digital solution to healthcare. There are people who can be empowered. The problem is, and I think it's this education gap, that it's very complementary with education. And so we need to figure out some of these technologies. We got to figure out something that doesn't require patient involvement. And the analogy I'll give is hypertension. You know, prior to the introduction of antihypertensives, you could control your blood pressure with diet and exercise. You know, and some people did, but it was very hard. And we developed antihypertensives, and it turns out those reduced health disparities. And no one questions now the availability of antihypertensives. So I think this ability of technology and actually to favor some of the people who suffer from these chronic diseases is an important issue. And so we want to make sure, I'm not suggesting at all that we don't pursue these technological solutions like digital medicine. I'm just saying we need to figure out how not to leave some people behind.
Other comments to that? Ma'am?
So I'm listening to all the different ideas that you were talking about and the different problems that we're having and should insurance reimburse it and things. And I'm wondering if perhaps what needs to happen is a secondary market needs to be developed where it's an insurance that maybe somebody who's young, 25 or 30, can start paying into now as the precursor to possible rejuvenation, like rejuvenation insurance. Rejuvenation technologies are coming along in the future, and if you start paying into them now, when you need them in the future, you'll have them. And oh, by the way, if you participate in these exercise programs, you can get dollars off of your premium every month. And if you come to the gym and you do these things, or you go to take certain supplements and things, and maybe something such as that could really help people have forward thinking in it. But also what it would do is create a test pool of people who would probably be willing to be a part of these trials for these rejuvenation technologies. You're saying that you might need 10 to 30,000 people to have a test group, and these might be people who are so interested in trying them that they would be the people that you could use and have the data to track from them, because they would already be used to being into a system where they were keeping track of their exercise, their vitamins, the food that they were eating, and thinking healthful. So it might be possible perhaps to create a system where all of those things are tied in. People are actually willing to pay in advance so that by the time the technology comes out, they're at the top of the list. They get to choose whether or not they want to be in the trials, and those technologies then would be paid for them as they come. And it would be outside of normal insurance.
I think we're still on policy.
Yeah, okay. It's a very interesting idea, and it has some, it's very intuitively appealing. The one problem we face is the, how do you do it, and always, so you think about long-term care insurance has that aspect. We kind of want people to pay for buy insurance now and say, okay, if you need to go into an assisted living facility, you can, you'll have the insurance, and the public won't have to pay for it through Medicaid. But those markets have always been hard to price, and we've limited the insurance. So while I intuitively love the idea, I think we just would have some challenges in how to price it and make it happen, but it's worth thinking about.
I'm not an insurance expert, but I thought that there was actually like a life insurance, one of the older life insurance style policies where that if you paid into it, you had to pay into it for a certain amount of time before it became viable. And so perhaps they could do that. Say this is an insurance you pay into for 10 years, and then you will be able to qualify.
Yeah, no, whole life policies kind of have that feature. But again, it's just it's a very interesting idea. And, we've been actually talking about doing something like that with cancer riders, because cancer has gotten very expensive. But we find that people do want access to those technologies. So,
I would point out that Aubrey has at times been contacted by the very, very large life insurance reinsurers for whom trillions of dollars of liabilities are involved in whether or not people can stay healthier longer. Mm-hmm. But I also want to remind you in the audience that I think the consensus here was not that we were hoping for 30,000 person trials, and not necessarily that you would even have to, as George was pointing out, insure against these. But if we could find effective ways to develop them quickly, we might just be able to buy them the same way you have your piston rings replaced. Sir?
Yeah, so it's you know, looking online, it seems that the anti-aging product market, you know, like the wrinkle cream, the hair coloring stuff, is about $122 billion per year. And it seems that if you actually had something, a real deal, anti-aging thing, that would be a pretty big carrot and prize. And I'm wondering if there was, I'm not sure how much response you get, if it'd be sufficient in terms of the real thing. I think the actual adoption would be, and people would pay, you know, pretty big chunks of money for it. If people were to say, okay, I will pre-sign up and kind of say, and kind of similar to that, but kind of more on the X price kind of thing of like, I will say, it's worth this much to me. Like, you know, it's $10,000 per year, $20,000 per year. If you give me the real deal, life extension, 10, 20, whatever years, you know, just more quantified, give more data around quantifying for insurance companies for other things, how much people want to pay for it.
Or another wacky idea, would something like this work? You know, when people have talked about with college education, it's so expensive. Not as expensive as ignorance. But there have been some days where people have said, look, you know, I'll fund someone to go to college and I get a % of their earnings.
No, that's
right?
always.
Is there sort of a health insurance variation on that?
Yeah, so that's a great analogy, and that's what these value-based purchasing contracts are. So again, take the example of take the example of a cancer drug. I will pay if this person's tumor shrinks.
Right.
You know, paying for response. So we can do that in rejuvenation technologies, and it makes a lot of sense. And it creates, what it does is it aligns everyone with the same incentives, which is I'm only going to get paid if my drug works or my technology works. And so I have every incentive to make sure that it does.
And if I as an individual, if my insurance cost goes down because of that, then
the
you
insurance,
need to align that incentive as well.
That's right. And when my insurance cost goes down, that affects everyone in the pool, and so everyone in the pool should pay just a little bit for that, and that's what happens.
Now, Dana, there's already some pretty strong European and UK national health service models where the national system is reimbursing based on response to the drug and chronic condition. Yeah. Is this a growing phenomenon in the United States? I
think the problem in the United States, maybe this is too in the weeds. In the United States, we have all these regulatory in a different, not an FDA sense. Right. So Medicaid, for example, has a rule that Medicaid gets the best price. So what happens if a company comes up with this arrangement with Kaiser? Well, it turns out it'll change their entire Medicaid pricing. So what happens is the company says, I don't want to do it. So in the United States, one thing we could do is start facilitating these arrangements. In addition, the other part of this is that we really need to solve the biomarker problem, because I don't think the companies are going to want to say, let's wait until, another 20 years before you pay me. Even the big guys don't want to do that. So we do need to develop the biomarkers for this. But the analogy here that's good is tumor size. So they don't want to get paid if based on mortality, but rather tumor size. And by the way, there was a lot of discussion about adherence. This also solves an adherence problem, because you say to the insurer, you have to make sure, in order for us to have this contract, you got to make sure this person takes the medication as indicated. So it creates incentives to, just like with the readmissions, for them to monitor adherence, which is the other problem.
So I have one of the things that Dale Shank said was that that one of the challenges, the challenge to developing drugs for Alzheimer's disease is there is no biomarker, there is no no outcome measure that everybody. So what's the motivation under your strategy?
Alzheimer's is a very thorny issue. By the way, with Alzheimer's, It's more like a contagious disease because it affects everyone around you. I mean, we've documented depression and caregivers. There's a whole cascade of social costs that are equal in cost to the health costs. So I would say actually in Alzheimer's, it's very different because that is a social epidemic and it warrants addressing. And in fact, because it affects people almost exclusively at older ages, it is a public insurance problem. It's Medicare. So it's actually, in some ways, easier to solve than the private insurer one.
We're going to run short, so these two, if they're discrete, will be just perfect.
Yeah, so I'll make it quick. So on staged market entry and lobbying for that, changing the existing law, anybody on stage or in the room here willing to be part of a consortium that will help us change the laws to get us away from the existing black and white paradigm of market entry?
Richard Barker from CASME right behind you.
And I'll quickly ask on behalf of the American Longevity Alliance is if we considered aging a disease, if we had the government consider aging as a disease, wouldn't it alleviate a lot of these problems that we're looking at? We could get funding in, we could get research out. We could get insurance to pay for these medications, because I think that something that you're overlooking is most Americans could not afford this kind of medication.
Wow, perfect last question. Can aging become the disease?
First of all, I don't think we're overlooking it. We are actually concerned about the cost. I think, I mean, you know, if erectile dysfunction is a disease, I'm thinking aging shouldn't have any problem. I don't know.
But also, interestingly, the populations like in East LA do not have this disease because they don't live long enough to age, right? So that really separates, I mean, Africa, Syria, you know, you just simply don't live long enough to have that disease of aging. So I mean, that's just a point I wanted to make. I don't really know what the answer is.
Well, I think actually you made the point earlier. You said we have to strengthen the safety net at the same time that we're doing these. So for instance, I agree with you that we should index the eligibility age of Social Security so that we can solve the fiscal issue. So suppose Social Security age is going up. At the same time, we need to make sure our disability program, for those who aren't reaching those retirement ages, they have the safety net to support them. But those are all, we've shown in our work, and there are other ways, if we had intelligent policy solutions, you know, this would be manageable. But there's a reason I live in Los Angeles and don't live in Washington, and that's because there's no intelligent discourse there. So.
Any quick wrap?
You could say that about LA too.
Listen, please don't leave just yet. We want to spend a couple minutes wrapping up, but I would like to pause here and thank Brock and Dana and Jean and George so much for your participation and for being here.